Welcome to the National Book Awards Campus Weekend at Concordia College. I'm Mark Creechy, Vice President for Academic Affairs, and I extend greetings to those here this evening, as well as others who are watching through our video production presented on the Internet. I'm pleased to introduce tonight's participants in the Readings and Conversation session. To my immediate left is Dr. Woody Holton. He is a National Book Award finalist in the nonfiction category for his book, Unruly Americans and the Origins of the Constitution. Dr. Holton is an associate professor of history at the University of Richmond. He received his doctorate from Duke University, specializing in colonial revolutionary America. Unruly Americans and the Origins of the Constitution tells the history of average Americans who challenged the framers of the Constitution and forced revisions on them, which produced the document we know today, referred to in Holton's epilogue as the Underdog's Constitution. Holton's scholarly work has garnered professional acclaim and national awards. He has published in numerous journals, and his other books have addressed such topics as the emergence of revolutionary sentiment in Virginia and enslaved Americans during the Revolutionary War. To his left, the next National Book Award finalist is Jim Shepard. Shepard is the J. Leland Miller Professor of English at Williams College, where he teaches writing and film. He earned his bachelor's degree from Trinity College and his MFA from Brown University. His collection of 11 first-person narratives, Like You'd Understand Anyway, is a National Book Awards finalist in the fiction category. This work offers an eclectic view of the human experience that brings us around the world and throughout history into the lives of a fascinating array of characters, from Hadrian's Wall to the Chernobyl nuclear meltdown. Shepard is the author of 6 novels and 2 previous collections of stories. His short fiction has appeared in Harper's, The Atlantic Monthly, and The New Yorker. Next, I will introduce our moderator for this evening, Minnesota Public Radio's Carrie Miller. Ms. Miller joined NPR in June 2004 as host of NPR's Mid-Morning and Talking Volumes, the joint book club of NPR, the Star Tribune, and the Loft Literary Center. She has been a radio and television news reporter since 1981. Before joining KARE 11 in 1996 and serving as its longtime political reporter, Miller was a reporter at stations in Minneapolis and Tulsa. She has won numerous awards, including the Society of Professional Journalists National Achievement Award and the Associated Press Award. Finally, I'm pleased to welcome back to Concordia the Executive Director of the National Book Foundation, Harold Augenbraum. In addition to his role as Executive Director of the Foundation, Mr. Augenbraum is well known for his scholarship on Latino literary studies and is currently editing the collected poems of Marcel Proust, to be published in 2008. Please join me in welcoming our guests to Concordia College.
Good evening, and thanks very much for the warm welcome. I've been looking forward to coming here. I know our guests have been too, so thanks for joining us tonight. If you listen to my program on Minnesota Public Radio, you know that I love books, novels, memoirs, crime stories, the classics. We just talked about To Kill a Mockingbird as part of our mid-morning book club, and when we opened the phone lines, they were immediately jammed, and that's yet another indication of how much our community there and this region just loves books. And I had that moment of smug satisfaction to say, where else, not even in New York, would you jam the phone line to
She's
talk
starting
about
out
To
taking
Kill a
a shot at you
Mockingbird?
there.
You're trying to start a regional conflict?
Yes, I am. So
She starts talking smack right at the beginning.
it only goes downhill
Look,
from
I'm
there.
from Jersey, you know.
Right. Okay, so here's the confession, though. Even though I am reading many, many books for the show, I have been glued to the television set because those contestants for American Idol are just so... No, kidding. I've been watching the miniseries on HBO about John Adams.
Right.
And it's just... I found... Has anybody seen it? Has anybody been watching it here? I just think the drama of, those Philadelphia Knights as they're debating the Declaration, the Continental Congress, and they're sweating and they're fighting among themselves, and it just doesn't get any better than that. And that recreation of that moment when Thomas Jefferson has brought Adams and Benjamin Franklin the draft of the Declaration, and they're arguing about the wording.
Every line, yeah.
And they start debating, well, what should the truths really be called? Mm-hmm. Should they be called sacred? And then Franklin chimes in and says, they're self-evident.
Right.
And they all say, yes, that's the perfect word. Let's put it into the Declaration. But it turns out that one of the most intriguing characters, I thought, in the series is John Adams' wife, Abigail. And Laura Linney, who was portraying Abigail Adams, recently told the New York Times that she considered Abigail the real founding First Lady because Martha Washington was so boring.
Poor Martha.
I would guess, though, that Laura Linney has no idea just how intriguing Abigail Adams was, and we find that out in Woody Holton's book. It turns out that she was a rather sophisticated war bond speculator, so convinced that bonds were a better deal than the real estate that her husband wanted to invest in, that she began buying and selling them on her own, building up a nest egg of what she labeled this money which I call mine, as you tell us in the book. And that's part of the extraordinary story at the center of Woody Holton's book, Unruly Americans and the Origins of the Constitution. We're going to talk about that tonight. It's also the kind of fascinating historical detail that I think our other author can appreciate. Jim Shepard recently confided to an audience, that his wife once described him as, quote, the only person she knows that would bring a history of the guillotine to the beach. Is that really true?
That is true, yeah. You have to be of another order of nerddom altogether.
I know, it's true. Good thing he did, because in one of the stories of his new collection, he's going to read an excerpt from that story tonight, we learn a lot about the inner life of a French Revolution executioner who tells us at one point, I'm a good Catholic. So we'll hear about that a little later in our conversation. We're also going to talk about this compelling story of three brothers who all played different roles in the Chernobyl disaster, written after Jim Shepard read the true testimony of the people that were involved. So tonight we're going to talk about the challenge of creating memorable, compelling, enlightening narratives out of history, whether you're writing fiction or nonfiction. So welcome our guests as we begin the conversation, if you will. So here's David McCullough, who wrote the Adams biography that the HBO series is taken from.
Right.
History is a guide to navigation in perilous times. History is who we are and why we are the way we are. Yes?
Yes, but.
Good. Take on
David
David McCullough.
Also a series of debates between the David McCulloughs of the world and people like me.
Mm-hmm. Why?
Two things. One, if you watch the Adams series on HBO, you'll think that John Adams fought the revolution almost alone. A little help from some guy named Washington from my home state, Virginia, but mostly Adams. And what a lot of historians, mostly academic historians, because to be honest, this stuff doesn't sell well, so they need a day job. But what a lot of historians are saying is, actually, it wasn't just the diplomats and the statesmen and the generals. It was common people who caused the war. I argue in my first book that if people like Jefferson and Washington hadn't been feeling pressure from their slaves, about almost half of Virginia was slaves. South Carolina had a black majority, and they had their own rebellions going on, and it was partly in response to those that Jefferson and Washington rebelled against the British. So this is a different version of the revolution seen from the bottom up. So I'd like to see people reading the McCulloch version of the revolution, but also reading mine, but also reading all these other people who are writing this other history from the bottom up.
Do you think there's too much hero worship in the history that becomes popular?
Yes.
And how does that happen?
Well, let me say first that McCulloch has always been very nice to me, and so I have nothing against him personally, but I do think that these sort of Father's Day volumes, which we call them, that are meant to sort of restore the wounded ego of guys like me, have a bad effect on our civic life. That is, that they tell us that's who can fix the country. The reason that book, I would argue with, and a lot of other historians would argue this too, the reason that book really took off is it came out in the wake of the Monica Lewinsky scandals. And people said, why can't we have people like John Adams who only, as far as we know, ever had sex with Abigail Adams? And I think it gets people thinking, and that's why I said it's a series of debates, because some of the people in this room may agree with McCulloch and not with me, but I don't think they were better than we were, the Founding Fathers. And I don't think some of us are better than others of us. But those books, I think, give us that impression. And so I think it can have a real dangerous effect on both on who's virtuous, to use the 18th century term, and who has an impact.
There's also something deeply reassuring about the sort of paternalistic pleasures of the great man theory. What we need are these absolutely masterful figures who know everything to come along and sort of say, I'll straighten this out for you,
right.
That kind of thing. And then we can all relax. We can give up our civic responsibility because John Adams is going to handle this, essentially. And there is something reassuring about that.
It's also easier to publish because the narratives are well-known narratives already in many cases. So what you end up with is that it's easier for them to sell this stuff. Not only do you have a well-known person writing, but you have a well-known subject, and you have, even though there might be some new material, a lot of it is well-worn, so it's comfortable for people to read. They're sort of like coming home to friends.
Yeah. Right.
Makes sense.
Now, with me, a lot of this is sour grapes because he's sold millions of copies and I've sold tens, maybe whatever, 20,000. And so I have to try to see past that. But I do think that
unsuccessfully in this case.
Well, yeah. I was about to say what he said. That it does damage civic life. I keep thinking all these Shakespeare plays. The difference with a Shakespeare comedy and tragedy is that in a comedy, the Duke arrives in time, right, and saves everything, the Deus Ex Machina, to save everything. And if we keep waiting to be saved by an Adams, we'll never be saved.
Jim, I feel like, having read your stories in this collection, that you're interested in that quest that McCulloch was talking about, that sense of trying to find out who we are and why we are the way we are. But it seemed like you weren't so much interested in the historic events themselves, but what they trigger.
I'm interested, and I think that's the way literature operates. I mean, I'm not that interested in literature whose main design is to sort of go, you are there at Gettysburg, I'm interested in the way these kinds of events can put enormous pressure on individuals and essentially create a kind of opportunity for emotional understanding, so that I'll often choose in some of these historical situations a worm's eye view because I'm emotionally myself. I'm interested in sort of responsibility without power. I'm interested in those people who are often given what seems to them to be an enormous task and they don't feel particularly ready to handle it. And somebody says, well, we're counting on you. Good luck. And so in the case of writing about Hadrian's Wall, I didn't write about the man who built it. I wrote about one of the poor schlubs who had to man it, essentially, and who had this sort of, you have from here to that half-mile mark, and that's your territory to cover. Good luck with the barbarians, that kind of thing.
But when you think about that, and you think about how you're going to take the historical event and then look at it from the worm's eye view, what's the first question you ask yourself?
Well, it doesn't start with a determined sense that I want to write about Hadrian's Wall. How do I go about it? What happens, going back to my long-suffering wife's comment, is I will be reading this stuff for my own pleasure. And something during that process will start to resonate with me in emotional terms. And
So when you were reading about guillotines at the beach, it was not,
was for
I
his
know
own
I'm going to
pleasure.
write a story
I know.
about this. It was truly, this is going to be
Can't
pleasurable.
you just see Carrie going, so you're weirder than I thought.
Exactly.
And
the
I
wheels
thought
are
you were
starting
weird.
to turn. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I'm reading about guillotines at the beach. Why? Because guillotines are interesting. At
What's
least
your
to me.
beach reading going to be this year?
I'm reading about avalanches right now. Why? I don't know, essentially. But at some point, reading about the history of the guillotine leads me to reading about the family whose hereditary job it was to be executioners of Paris, which then made me think, well, that's an interesting family dynamic. And that then made me think, I'm interested in this. What is it? I'm interested in the father saying to the son, forget about being a baker. Have I got a job for you, kind of thing. And that then causes me to think, I'm interested enough in this emotionally that I'm going to start researching with a story in mind. But that's a fairly late stage. I mean, I'm not realizing that I'm going to write a story until I'm a little ways into it.
How unusual is that in literature?
Well,
that
I think
approach?
absolutely everybody has a different viewpoint. You get people who actually say, a line came to me and a novel grows out of it.
Mm-hmm.
And some people structure an entire novel. Mystery writers are well known for this, structuring an entire novel and then just sort of filling in the gaps. Nabokov was well known for writing out pieces on index cards and then having his wife type them up, and then he filled in the gaps in between. So I think everybody has a different way of looking at it, and I think it's based on personality, but it's also based on an artistic way that they want to get into something.
Mm-hmm. Can I ask Harold a question?
Of course.
Why is it, I'm going back to your earlier comment about people it seems like the market wants to read the same old story. I would literally say, with all respect for McCulloch, that I'd read every word of that book.
He's still mad about McCulloch.
What a way to start.
Yeah.
I hope David never
Thanks for
sees
bringing that
this.
up, by the way.
I know.
Just
Is there a couch that I can sit on?
David's coming to the Twin Cities. I could play this part of it.
Full being taped, is it?
Full disclosure.
Yeah.
Full disclosure. We gave our Lifetime Achievement Award to McCulloch a couple of years ago. So
I appreciate you disclosing that, and I withdraw the question.
Yeah.
No, the question's a good one. Why is it?
My question, and I think you're right. Well, and here's my extreme statement about that. I feel like I read every word of McCulloch's John Adams biography before he'd written any of those words.
Mm-hmm.
Just because it's all stuff that we knew already. And you're right. I think people want to be soothed in a way to read those same stories again. And yet, Jim Shepard tells unusual stories, and people want to read. It seems like people want the new in fiction and not so new in nonfiction.
Yeah, the problem with your theory is you're imagining that Jim Shepard sells well. When in fact Jim Shepard's kids are eating dog food. So.
There's a story for you.
Yeah.
Well, I think it is the fact that it's comfortable for people. And what they do is if you recycle the narrative and then write it, and McCulloch's a good writer.
Absolutely.
I mean, he's a good storyteller more than anything else.
Absolutely.
So recycling that in a way is, and I think you're right too, I think that everything appeared before. The other thing about it is that commercial publishers aren't always interested these days in original research. It takes a long time. You may have to, subsidize them to go to Paris or in case of John Adams in Amsterdam for a while. So, commercially it works, and people are going to buy a well-written story about John Adams or Benjamin Franklin. And what's interesting too is we haven't got that many books on the founding mothers.
Funny you should
Speaking
mention
of
that.
which, yay! We'll talk about that a little later.
Okay.
All right, we're going to get to that. I want to talk a little bit about the research that you did for the story on Chernobyl, the zero-meter diving team. That maybe you'd read an excerpt from that. But is it true that you went back to the oral testimony of the people that were there?
Yeah, there's been a huge amount in the last 5 or 6 years. A huge amount of oral testimony that had been gathered was finally printed in Russian and then translated into English. And so there's been an explosion of that kind of stuff that's been made available.
Now, when you went to that, did you think there will be a fascinating story here that I'll want to write about it? Or again, were you reading it just because?
No, again, I'm even weirder than that. What was happening was I was reading about the decay of the sarcophagus, which is the kind of terraced pyramid that they built in a great hurry and a great loss of life around the destroyed reactor. Mm-hmm. And that sarcophagus is breaking down very rapidly. And so that's a subject of some interest. And I was reading about that, and then that led me to narratives of the people who had built the sarcophagus, because those are the people who know just how poorly it's made, all of whom are dying or dead. And that led me to the other oral testimonies. And by the time I got to the other oral testimonies, I thought, I want to write about this. And part of the reason I did was, again, almost entirely affective. It was almost entirely emotional, because what I was getting over and over again was, I'm trying to figure out on this sort of gigantic scale how people could be so, at such a great cost, be so unwilling to face the truth. Mm-hmm. Because the staggering about Chernobyl is not so much the stupidity that went into the actual accident, although that's fairly staggering, but the 3 days in which the government just said there's no problem and left those people exposed, children and workers and everybody exposed to staggering amounts of radiation, and then announced afterwards that there was no radiation problem among those people. And that kind of denial on that kind of civic scale seemed to me well worth trying to figure out. And I suddenly began to, when I was going over these oral testimonies, I began to realize it sounded so much like the denial we have in our personal lives all the time. It sounded so much like, yeah, Uncle Sid's an alcoholic, and we all know he's an alcoholic, but we act like he's not an alcoholic. And then one day we were surprised because his liver blew up. That's surprising, and you'd be like, but you all knew this all the way up. Yeah, and we all, And so then I began to realize that I could work my way down to these people who were there and work my way up from these people to trying to figure out how that system got perpetuated.
And it's interesting that you would choose then to bring the family dynamic into that too. I mean, you could have chose people in the town for that, but you wanted 3 brothers.
3 brothers and a father, and a tyrannical father, essentially, because that sense of both the limitations and the power of that kind of unconditional love was fascinating to me in this context. What does it mean to let your brother down in this case? What does it mean to support your brother? What does it mean for your father to say, we're not going to look into this? And at what point do you have a responsibility for filial revolt?
Will you read an excerpt?
No, I can't. I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I was warned about him. Who took the oral testimony, by the way?
Oh, all sorts of people. More or less, it's sort of like the kind of thing Woody's talking about. People more or less on their own. It certainly wasn't the government. But you would have people saying, look, you tell me your story, and I'm going to save it. Almost always in electronic form. This is a little ways into the story, maybe a couple pages in. What is there to say about the power station or the river on which it sits? The Pripyat, just a few kilometers downstream, drains into the Dnieper, having snaked through land as level as a soccer pitch, with a current the color of tea from the peat bogs nearby. In the deeper parts, it's cold year-round. For long stretches, it dips and loops around stands of young pines. Mikhail was pleased with the area when he settled there. He was the young tyro, the coming thing, at 28, a senior turbine engineer. There were 3 secondary schools, a young people's club, festive, covered markets, a 2-screen cinema, and a Children's World department store. Plenty of good walking trails and fishing. Petya followed him. Petya usually followed him, from assignment to assignment, getting odd jobs, getting drunk, getting thrown in jail, getting bailed out of trouble by his brother, or half-brother. Why doesn't he ever follow you? Mikhail asked me the night Petya showed up on his doorstep yet again. Mikhail didn't often call. It was a bad connection that sounded like wasps in the telephone line. Petya was already asleep in his dining room. He'd walked the last 20 versts after having hitched a ride on a cement truck. They found him a little apartment in town and a job on the construction site for the spent fuel depository. As for a residence permit, for that, Mikhail told me on the phone they'd rely on their big shot brother. I was ready to help out. We both treated Petya as though he had to be taught to swallow. Let me do that, we'd tell him, before he'd even commenced what he was going to attempt. whatever went wrong in our lives, we'd think they still weren't as fucked up as Petch's. Mikhail's shift came on duty at midnight, an hour and 25 minutes before the explosion. Most of the shift members did not survive until morning. Petya, I was told later, was fishing that night with another layabout, a friend. They'd chosen a little sandbar near the feeder channel across from the turbine hall, where the water released from the heat exchangers into the cooling pond was 20 degrees warmer. In spring it filled with hatchlings. There was no moon, and it was balmy for April and starry above the black shapes of the cooling towers.
Thanks.
Thank you. Oh, no, really.
So he had some new history in a way to go back to, because there was no official record of the oral testimony.
Right.
And whatever official was there was wrong. When you go back into the historical texts that historians have been poring over for eons, tell me how you're looking for something fresh and the process of trying to find something that somebody maybe didn't already know.
Yeah. Well, and writing about the American Revolution, all that's especially hard because, as you said, so many people have looked at so much of it. But it is surprising how many, for instance, of the biographers who I was trashing before, read sort of the same letters as each other.
Yeah.
And there are lots of things out there that don't get looked at very much. One thing, I had a lot of fun with petitions to the state legislatures, and many of which were signed. There was one 6-foot-long petition to the South Carolina legislature against the slave trade. None of the people signing it was a slave. A lot of people did sign with their marks, but these were free white male citizens of South Carolina, some of whom had religious opposition to the slave trade, but many more had economic issues with the slave trade. But those petitions, you sometimes can hear an authentic voice of people beyond the Adamses and Jeffersons. And actually the newspapers, there was a huge explosion of newspapers during that period. And in some ways the papers were better then than today. They were openly partisan, but partisan on both sides, partly because they just needed copy to fill the columns with. No paper in America had a full-time writer working for it. All of their stuff was either generated by the editor himself or herself. A lot of these were women editors because their husband had been running the paper and then he died.
Interesting.
And often the women ran it a lot better than her husband had. That won't surprise you. But only until the first son is old enough to take it over. So even if she's been running it well, she turns it over to her son when he comes of age, 21. So you've got the editor, and that's about it. And so for copy, the stuff has to come in. A lot of it's anonymous. And so people can say things anonymously. I actually would argue ironically, that these public essays in newspapers are often more honest than private letters between even a husband and wife, because they're anonymous. And if I write I'm John Adams and I'm down in Philadelphia at the Continental Congress and I'm writing my wife back in Braintree, Massachusetts, it's unlikely that she'll be the only person to read the letter. A lot of people are going to read. And he had one actually where he, in typical John Adams style, I don't know if this is in the movie, makes fun of all his colleagues there in the Continental Congress, has bad things to say about all of them. And the Tories captured it and published it in one of their newspapers to great embarrassment on his part. So that's when they adopted started using pen names. She took the name Portia, which was the name of Brutus's wife.
Yeah.
So it's really interesting that you would and Brutus, of course, is most famous for being an assassin of Julius Caesar. So it would be like my wife taking the pen name Mrs. Lee Harvey Oswald. But it shows how they felt about charity, so that's a whole interesting sort of thing. But so there are actually these wonderful essays in newspapers. What's today is the op-ed section and the letters to the editor were most of the paper, except for ads and reprints of news from other papers. So there are chances. Now, a lot of it's inauthentic. For instance, the classic Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania by John Dickinson, who never got his hands dirty in his life, wasn't a farmer at all. He was a lawyer. So they got to be used with care, and sometimes we screw up. But there are ways to hear voices besides the dominant ones.
I want to read just a couple lines from the epilogue of your book, and then maybe you'll read an excerpt of it. You write, "Today Americans exude immense pride in their democratic republic, but beneath that surface sentiment lurk nagging feelings, not only that you can't fight City Hall, but that you shouldn't, since we all know what happens when ordinary folks get their hands on the levers of power." What are you saying?
I'm not agreeing with that, by the way. That's the sentiment that I'm battling. Because I think a lot of history classes and poli-sci classes use the 1780s the same way that historians used to use the 1870s. Mm-hmm. That is, the 1870s, right after the Civil War, it's fascinating to go in my home state in Virginia and look at the photographs that they take of the legislature every year. And if you go back to the 1870s, you're going to see among those legislators something that you don't see for decades, you still don't see until just the last 20 years, and that is lots of black faces. That is, lots of former slaves got elected during the Reconstruction period to the legislature. And historians for a long time said, I'm going to answer your question in a minute. I know this seems like it has nothing to do with your question.
Don't worry.
But historians used to say, oh, the former slaves, they used less pretty terms, but the former slaves got into power and they wrecked everything. They took bribes and they let those carpetbaggers come down here. And so we had to have what they call redemption, where basically the former slaveholders pushed the former slaves out. This is when the Ku Klux Klan was born for that purpose. And the old planter aristocracy regained power and kept it right up until the Civil Rights Movement of the 60s. And people say, in a sense, less famously, but they say the same thing about the decade that led to the Constitution. What many historians say is that the decade that led to the Constitution, and of course I'm not talking about the Declaration of Independence, which is dismembering an empire in 1776. I'm talking about this decision 10 years later to make an empire out of the United States, mm-hmm. to take these 13, Virginia and Pennsylvania were as separate as Mexico and the United States are today.
But you were saying, a lot of people think
that what was proved during that first decade was that when you let ordinary people run things, they are going to mess it up. They're going to wreck, in the same way that slaves wrecked things, the former slaves supposedly wrecked things in the 1870s. Average farmers ran things for our first decade as a country when we were 13 separate countries, and they wrecked everything. And so it was necessary for elites to come in and write the Constitution, which everybody who writes about this agrees the Constitution was much less democratic than what came before. Before the Constitution, we had most of our elected officials were elected every single year directly by the people. And the Constitution gives you a House of Representatives every 2 years, but a Senate every 6, President every 4, and Supreme Court for life. And only the House of Representatives was elected directly by the people. The Senate not until 1913, and the President, Supreme Court, of course, still not now. So what we all agree on was that the Constitution was much less democratic than what came before. And then the debate is that a good thing? And most historians and political scientists and judges and lawyers will tell you yes, because we gave them their chance. We gave the farmers their chance, and they blew it. And I'm arguing in the book, not that that's necessarily wrong, but it's something we ought to talk about, because I don't think it is wrong. I think that there were problems in the 1780s, but they weren't the farmers' fault.
An excerpt?
Yeah, you want the one on 65.
Is that right?
Yes.
She doesn't sound happy about it, does she?
65, yes.
You sure you want
Unless
that?
you just like to read a chapter.
Well, you want another one from Jim, actually?
Yeah.
Most descriptions of the road to the Constitution draw attention to the same mileposts. The Federal Convention mustered a quorum on May 25th, 1787, and completed its work 4 months later, on September 17th. Delaware became the first state to ratify on December 7th, 1787, and so on. Inevitably, these timelines omit one of the Constitution's most pivotal red-letter dates. On September 27th, 1785, Congress sent the 13 state legislatures a bill for $3 million. This requisition set off several initially distinct chains of events that, upon merging, immeasurably intensified the momentum for the Constitution. There was nothing new about Congress's placing huge demands on the states. It had done that throughout the Revolutionary War. Back then, though, paymasters and purchasing agents working for the British and French armies had scattered gold and silver throughout the countryside, making taxes much easier to pay. Moreover, Americans could discharge many of these wartime taxes using paper money that had depreciated to a fraction of its face value. Congress had no power to enforce its demand, so the state legislatures could simply have ignored the 1785 requisition. But most made good faith efforts to fill their quotas, with dire consequences. In 3 states, taxes levied in compliance with the requisition helped turn farmers' earlier requests for paper money into irresistible demands. The state's attempts to raise the revenue that Congress had requested also provoked some of the most wide-ranging farmers' revolts in American history. Witnessing what happened in states that tried to comply with the 1785 requisition, 2 state assemblies explicitly announced that they would not even try to fill their quotas. No piece of legislation at either the state or federal level did more to advance the momentum for the Constitution than the virtually unknown requisition of 1785.
It's really interesting. Thanks. Woody writes in his book that truth is often hidden under a thick coat of common misperceptions. Do you think that's true?
Truth is hidden under... do I think that's true?
Has he got it right?
I have to say, Woody's wrong about almost everything. He's not even in the right chair right now. I mean, it'd be hard to argue with that as a basic tenet, in that almost always what we're settling on is, I think, an overly simplified version. Sometimes it's flat wrong, which is when the historians sort of say eureka, and I don't think it was A at all, I think it was B. Normally, the historians move those to go, especially the academic historian, is to go, not just A. It was more complicated than that. It's A plus B plus C, and I think D as well. And you know, that move towards continual calibration, continual nuancing, that seems logical, right? I mean, it does turn out that the world is a more complicated place than a lot of ideologues claim it to be, or a lot of people who just check out things very casually claim it to be.
Yeah, I was curious, especially after we had the conversation that we had at dinner, where you were saying that people will be much more honest when they're wearing a mask. Isn't that what you were saying?
Yeah, there's a line of Oscar Wilde's that I quoted in a talk today that I gave to a group of faculty and students, where Wilde says, man is least honest when he speaks in his own persona. Give a man a mask and he will tell the truth, essentially.
It's like anonymous newspaper entry.
Yeah, right, exactly.
But he goes, getting back to my point.
What about me in this whole conversation? Harold, how do you think Jim Shepard works that element into the storytelling that he does?
The idea of misperception and truth. I think that one of the things about what's kind of interesting about his work, and especially these short stories, is the fact that he comes up with someone in a popular situation that you might not have thought about. I mean, there's a sort of there's a correlation between these 2 books, actually.
Right.
So that's sort of the people who are raised to something of a mythic level by the writing itself, and by taking these people. You know, it seems to me, for example, when I was reading the guillotine story, the executioner story,
which we're going to hear an excerpt from.
The executioner seemed to me, and in my memory, the executioner seems gigantic. He seems very, very big. And I think one of the things about taking people who are completely unknown and raising them to levels of mythic characters is one of the things that artists can do. Mm-hmm. And it's one of the things that they do best.
What about this idea, though, of the mask really revealing the truth? Well,
you know, it's interesting, because I think that almost every work of art I've read is a type of mask. So if you sort of look at it as a type of mask, it's not actually, and it may not be everything that you read in the mask may not be true because the things that you write aren't necessarily true. They're reimagined. And that creates a mask that then reveals a truth. So that by creating that mask, the misperceptions are taken away, according to Jim.
Yeah, which is a big caveat. But as Woody was saying, there is a way in which, when he was talking about his anonymous letter writers, there's a way in which once you think that you're safe behind that mask, you're willing to say some truths that you're not otherwise willing to say.
Why is that, do you think?
Well, in your case, it's the costs of directness might be too much to bear, essentially. I teach creative writing, and I'll often have students go, once there was a daughter not anything like me who really was mad at her mom.
Not my mother.
Who's not anything like my mom. But one day she dreamt about killing her in a house very different than my house. And it's just, you can feel the liberation in some ways because they have that little bit of,
Talk a little bit about the story of the executioner.
Where to begin with an executioner story? As I said, it began with that the history of the guillotine, which is not a book you come across very often, right? But again, those kinds of historical paradoxes fascinate me. I mean, here's a machine that's a product of the Enlightenment, that's a product of a group of people who considered themselves to be extraordinarily compassionate and rational human beings who said, look, this is a terrible way to kill people, to cut people's heads off with swords. It's a terrible we need to come up with a way that's humane, and we need to come up with a way that's efficient. And they were also, they thought, rationalizing France's mode of capital punishment because before the guillotine, how you died at the hands of the state depended on your class. And they thought, well, that's not fair. Everybody should die the same way. And so they came up with the guillotine. And one of the things that the designer of the guillotine sort of foresaw, and almost no one else, was this allows the process to be accelerated quite a bit. And, of course, what he was foreseeing without fully realizing it was at the height of the terror, they were killing a person every 2 minutes on the scaffold, which was, of course, absolutely impossible with swords or with axes or whatever. So there was actually a momentum to the murderousness that was only possible because of this Enlightenment machine. And so that sort of thing led me to, again, well, who's running this machine? And that led me to the history of this family. And the history of the family was wonderful because to a man, every one of them was unbelievably self-pitying. And I just thought, who's a greater character than a self-pitying executioner, right? It's like, I always got blood all over me, and I just, the head bounces, and what are you gonna, nobody likes me, So I just thought that kind of absolutely unjustified whining self-pity, I could identify with that instantly. That's my life, essentially. So I thought, this I can write about, I think.
How about an excerpt?
Yeah,
Great.
Sure. Notice I don't mind that you chose these, not like Woody.
I know. He was a little standoffish after the note went out about the excerpts. What? I don't get to read half of my book at the...
I think Woody just realizes that we'd all be better off just listening to his book, really. That seems fair, right?
You're in Minnesota. You're supposed to be nice.
I asked
See, I don't stereotype like that, but that's okay.
Yeah, really. I asked these guys if they knew each other before this trip.
No.
But you're made for each other.
We were lovers for many years, but we never knew each other.
Why do I have to be Teller, though? Why am I Teller? You're Ben.
Boy, I guess we're out of time, aren't we?
No. No, plenty of time.
Plenty of time, okay. This is 2 or 3 paragraphs into this story. How far am I going here? You want to know. All France wants to know what takes place in the executioner's mind. The figure who before the revolution wielded the double-bladed axe and double-headed sword and who branded, burned, and broke on the wheel all who came before him. The figure who now slides heads through what they call the Republican window on the guillotine. Does he eat? Does he sleep? Do his smiles freeze the blood? Is he kind to those he kills? Does he touch his wife on days he works? Does he reach for you with blood-rimmed fingernails? Does he spring full-blown from a black pit to send batch after batch through the guillotine? Becoming shrill, my wife calls it, whenever I get too agitated in my own defense. I am a good Catholic. The people's judges hand out their sentences, and mine is the task of ensuring that their words become incarnate. I am the instrument, and it is justice that strikes. I feel the same remorse as anyone required to be present at an execution. Before the Revolution, justice was apportioned and discharged in the name of the king, who ruled by divine right as one of God's implements. Punishment of malefactors was God's will and therefore earned for his sovereign minister God's grace and esteem. But in the eyes of most, that grace and esteem did not extend as far as the sovereign's handservant. Before the Revolution, daughters of executioners were forbidden to marry outside the profession. When their girls came of age, such families had to display on their doors a yellow affidavit clarifying the family's trade and acknowledging the taint in their bloodline. Letters of commission and payments were not passed into their hands, but dropped before them. They were required to live at the southern ends of towns, and their houses had to be painted red. Before the Revolution, a woman with whom I dined at an inn demanded I be made to appear in court to apologize for having shared with her a dinner table. She petitioned that executioners be directed to wear a particular badge or color upon their coats or singlets so that all would know their profession. Before the Revolution, our children were allowed no playmates but one another. Oh, don't.
Should we applaud just because you don't like it? Let's talk about Abigail Adams. I was asking you at dinner about how you came up on this story that I think you've said really saved.
She utterly
Okay,
saved
so
me.
how'd you find this?
Well, look at it this way. As you were coming back to me, they're all going, oh, good, Holton's going to read about another requisition.
Oh, yeah. Well, it isn't guillotines, but...
So that's where I sort of still am, but where I was for years on this, because while he gets to make up all these cool stories about guillotines and Chernobyl and Hadrian's Wall, I'm reading tax laws. And actually, here's how I would link it. You've done a great job of linking these two books, if you don't mind me saying. How I would link them is he's taking these faceless Russians and Frenchmen and making them interesting, and I'm taking the Constitution and making it boring. Which I'm very proud of that.
Not true.
But so because I'm into these economic roots of the Constitution, which involves following, because there's, I'm not going to try to summarize it because we'll lose them. But you look.
They're all still there.
But there are all these. There are issues that produce the Constitution that have nothing to do with what we thought in high school, to do with taxation. And you might remember from high school Shays' Rebellion, which was a tax revolt, and there were rebels like that. That's near his home, but there were rebels like that in almost every state who didn't think there was too much democracy, to refer to what I was talking about earlier, thought there was too little, and really had a grand democratic vision of what the United States can be, a vision that we still haven't realized. They had much higher aspirations than we do today. So that was going on, and what they were really rebelling against was the rebellion against Britain had been no taxation without representation, right? We all learned that in grade school. So as soon as they get their own representatives, what did those representatives do? Impose taxes that were 5 times higher than they'd ever paid back as British colonists. But I had to go through all that stuff about the taxes, and then the purpose of the taxes was to pay off the speculators who had bought up the war bonds, and there were literally scores of different kinds of bonds and the price movements. It's fascinating to me. And not to hardly anybody. And to Jim, actually. Yeah. I've gotten him really thrilled about
Me too.
Is it fair to say that you were looking for an interesting central character through which you could explain why this mattered?
That I could use to put a face on all the others. And I would find a little letter by this guy, but nothing else. And then somebody would have something in his account book but no text, so it didn't really put a face on it. And almost when it was too late, when the book was getting to that point where it wasn't time to make major changes. And actually just reading in the traditional sources, but all the biographers like McCulloch, who I admire so much, missed this because it's in this obscure language where Abigail is saying to John Adams, stop investing your money in land. That's not where the money is. I can make you 10 times a return rate that's 10 times greater speculating in bonds. So I found my guy. He's a gal.
Set the scene for me in a way. I mean, you've gone through all these texts.
Right.
You come upon what you said was an obscure historical text, and suddenly you come on, it's Abigail Adams.
Right.
She can be my...
Right.
That's right?
Absolutely.
And nobody...
Absolutely. To try to do the chain, people like her who had bought up these bonds were leaning on the state governments to adopt really high taxes. And the state governments did adopt those high taxes. And those high taxes provoked ordinary farmers to rebel. And then elites said, oh, my God, the farmers are rebelling. We've got to totally revise the government by writing the Constitution. So in a sense, she's at the big. She's the one shaking. She's starting the chain reaction.
Right.
People like her. So she's not just getting her smallpox inoculation like you see in the HBO movie, which is very cool. Very cool.
Which was really...
But that's not all she's up to.
So you're going to write about her in your next biography, right?
Yes.
What has not...
Because Harold says there's a deficit of founding mothers biographies, so I just decided...
We're gonna talk about that, but
Simon & Schuster, available next year.
What hasn't been said about her that needs to be said?
Not only this part of the financial stuff, but you quoted a line from the book, which is from a letter from her, which she not only bought all these bonds in her husband's name, she got to run the family finances while he was off running the country, and did a much better job of it than he ever had, because he had this sort of misty notion that patriotic virtue requires me to invest in land. That land is safe for me, it's safe for the country. I'm stealing with my excerpt. And she goes, no. We can make much more money with the bonds. She invests his money in bonds, but she also set aside some of that money. Remember now, when she married him in October of 1764, 8 months before their first child was born, which is another part of my story.
That's just gossip, you know?
See, this is going to sell books.
Yeah.
Bonds, forget it.
Yeah, really.
This is going to be a big Mother's Day book.
This comes under the heading of creating the mask to get to the truth.
Is there anything you want to share with us?
When she got married, she became dead in the eyes of the law. That's the way the common law treated women long after the Revolution. And yet she took some of that money that she was making. She set up a merchant. She set up as a merchant during the Revolutionary War. John would send over his salary from France in goods that she would sell, and she made a killing because prices go way up during wartime, as we're learning. And she took some of this money and just declared it money which I call mine. And she had to say call because under the eyes of the law, he could have taken it at any time. But what's fascinating about that to me, and there's other little things she did, she refers another time to my own pocket money. All of this is a fiction. That she doesn't actually legally own anything, but she's determined to set some of this to lay claim to some of the family's holdings. And that fascinated it to me because we all know about the Remember the Ladies letter that she wrote to John.
We know about the romance and the strength of the marriage and the
all
intimacy between them.
Well, and we also, exactly. So we know we got a romantic marriage, and we also know that she wrote one letter saying women should have rights.
Right.
What's fascinating to me is that although she loved her husband, she also demanded that some of those proto-feminist ideals that she articulated happen inside her household.
Is that the kind of story about the founding mothers that hasn't been told?
Well, I think not only the founding mothers, I think that the stories of the spouses, the wives of great American men probably have not been told in a generation, I would say. A good biography of Abigail Adams.
Why?
Well, this is changing. For
There's
example,
a lot of women readers out there. This would be a natural.
It is interesting, but as Woody would probably point out, what people are really interested in is the ones who made the country, and the domestic sphere has not been that as important. It's just not been important to the American people, I would say. So this sort of idea of domesticity is different from the political, where they were out there and they were developing, the country the way it turned out. And I think that there's also an image that we were talking about Susan Faludi's book at dinner, and I think that there's an image that the men wrote history, and when they wrote history, some of it was revisionist.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that they're going to be looking at this and they're going to say, who really made the country?
Yes, exactly. You saw the HBO movie, and you saw when they were one of the most dramatic scenes is when they're doing their smallpox inoculation. In those days, you didn't have cowpox as your inoculation for smallpox the way we do today. You'd take actual smallpox. You'd get somebody who's got one of those big pustules on his face.
They actually carded people that were in full pox mode.
Right.
And they would actually
you don't
lay
have to
around
use the technical term.
Jim, this sounds like a good story idea
I know.
for you.
Suddenly the antenna went, what? Full pox
mode.
Cards. Ew.
I'm off to the beach.
That was pretty startling.
So, but what I'm saying, where did that notion, which saved probably 1 million lives in the United States alone, that method before the Jenner method, which is even safer, came up. Where did it come from? Cotton Mather was a famous Puritan minister who learned it from one of his slaves who had done it in his village back in West Africa. So that slave helped make the country. And so I think Harold's really raised the issue, which is who made the country. And we're getting a much broader vision of that.
An excerpt about Abigail?
If you insist.
Page 65.
No. Do you want me to read about the requisition again?
Well, we never get tired of that one.
John Adams's ambivalence about bond speculation manifested itself in a long-running dispute with his wife, Abigail. John initially balked at investing in depreciated government paper, contending that real estate was safer, both for the investor and for his country. The ideal he constantly held before himself was the virtuous Roman senator whose vote was not for sale because his landed estate ensured his financial independence. Securities traders, by contrast, were what every republic had to avoid at all costs. A narrow faction with both the motivation and the clout to manipulate the government in its favor. Although born and raised on the Massachusetts coast near Boston, Adams partook of some of the same pastoralism we associate with Jefferson, who considered those who labor in the earth the chosen people of God. Abigail Adams' situation was different. As long as her husband lived, and as it turned out, he outlived her, she could never experience the pleasure of owning property. On the other hand, she played an even bigger role than John did in deciding how his money was spent. Entitled to use what she could not own, Abigail naturally cared less about what form the family's assets took than about the rate of return. In any event, it may be less accurate to describe John Adams as ambivalent about bond speculation than to note that his actions did not always match his ideals. The simple fact is that he did allow his wife to make him a speculator. It was one more useful role she played in the relationship, the devil who made him do it.
Really interesting. I look forward to your biography. Will you find your last excerpt? But one last excerpt.
Do you want it from one of the same two stories?
Right. But
Right.
no, whatever you want to read. But I want to ask you each then, as we close our conversation, about the books that you go back to over and over again that you love.
Want me to start?
Yeah.
I carry one volume of Proust with me wherever I go.
Yeah.
You're a New Yorker.
Strange. Yes, I'm a New Yorker. That's what we do. And as a matter of fact, I've talked about it here before. It's probably because it's a compelling narrative, but it's the thing that's taught me most about literature is reading it over and over again.
Okay. Books that you go back to over and over again, and why?
There is a book about, it's called A Midwife's Tale, and it's written...
Laura Thatcher
Ulrich, that's right. And it's about a woman who was a wife in the province of Maine, which was then part of Massachusetts, living during and after the Revolutionary War, who delivered more than 1,000 babies, recorded them all in her diary, so Laura Ulrich was able to write this biography, didn't lose a single mother in childbirth, had a rate of mortality with the kids, of low mortality with the kids, that wasn't matched by that county of Maine in their hospitals by the male doctors until the 1930s, and who, in order to make these deliveries, she lived on the banks of the Kennebec River and had to make a lot of these deliveries on the other side of the river, and as Laura Ulrich says, would cross the river on canoe during the summer, on foot during the winter, and for a whole lot of the in-between on hope.
Wow. Is she the one that said well-behaved women rarely make
Yes,
history?
although she totally didn't mean what everyone who puts the bumper sticker on their car thinks
What'd
she
she mean?
She meant, I want to write about women. And there aren't a lot of records about women, so where am I going to find women showing up in the records? I got to go to the criminal records. Those are the women who we can find in history because their names are written down when they bring them in order to get ready to put them in the guillotine. Or whatever, they're going to whip them for slander or whatever. So all she meant was, if you want to write about women, you're going to, that's an exaggeration, but most of the women you're going to find in the records are criminals. So she didn't mean stand up and
power to the...
I mean, she's for that. I know her, but that wasn't... But she enjoys the irony that her statement has taken on a whole new meaning.
You've burst my bubble, but don't worry about it.
That's what we're here for.
Job well done.
Job well done. We've done it.
All right. How about a final excerpt from
Okay.
you? How about that?
All right.
And then we'll close our conversation because we've gone long.
I'll do a short.
No, that's okay.
How much difference could an individual bureaucrat really make in our system? That was a popular topic for our drinking bouts. For the epic bouts, we seem to require a topic. The accepted wisdom, which tempered our cynicism enough to smooth the way for our complacency, was that with clever and persistent and assiduous work and some luck, the great creeping hulk that was our society could be nudged in this or that direction. But one had to be patient and work within the system and respect the system's sheer size. Because you see, our schools directed all their efforts to inculcating industriousness, somewhat successfully, obedience, fairly successfully, and toadyism, very successfully. Each graduation produced a new crop of little yes people. Our children learned criticism from their families and from the street.
Favorite books that you go back to before we...
Probably Nabokov's memoir, Speak Memory, Nabokov's novel, Lolita, and Flannery O'Connor's collected stories. Those would be books I keep returning to.
Thank you all. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
For an interesting conversation.
Appreciate
it.
Good job, Eddie. Good job.
You're invited to a reception at the Yildisacker Library where the authors will be available to sign their books and to continue our conversation. And please join me one more time in thanking our guests tonight.
Thanks. Yeah.
Thank you, Nick.
Thanks, Dean. Thank you. You all can sign mine first.
Of course.
How
Oh,
about
I would
that?
love to.
With all the little